And this discussion session is meant to get a conversation started, and one that we hope will continue in other venues if interest is high enough. We'll direct each of the questions that we have first at our panel and then immediately out into the general audience, because we want a conversation between all of us. And we encourage everyone to share experiences that have shaped your opinions rather than just the opinion.
What is involved in intentional commitment to a country? And of course, we're talking about for you, from your experience. What is involved in intentional commitment to a country? What is the cost of living in a country for a long period without making a commitment to it? To the individual, to the community in which he or she is now living. Is this cost to the community greater in a democracy?
Okay, what is intentional commitment to a country? Well, I'm an American citizen, and even when I didn't live in this country, I felt very committed to it. And I certainly made, the way of demonstrating my commitment, of course, was to write angry letters and to vote when we were allowed to vote, because we weren't allowed to vote until fairly recently, as Americans in a foreign country. And as far as a commitment to the community, I do feel that in a democracy, of course, your commitment can be much greater, and of course should be much greater.
As it is?
I mean, you know, I obviously work on immigrants' rights issues, and so I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the whole question of citizenship, and also, you know, going to different countries. For example, I was at a conference in Mexico this past November with immigrants' rights advocates from the Americas, from Latin America, and the whole question of global citizenship came up, you know, world without borders, and the ideas of, which I don't think have been explored as much in the US, the ideas of us as, you know, as world citizens, and the commitment that we have to the world at large, and to our, you know, our fellow global citizens, rather than, you know, as to us as Americans, or us as Iranians, and us as, you know, Texans, or and I just think that, you know, we're so, at this moment in time, we're so far from that concept. But I think, you know, obviously in this day and age where we, hopefully those of us, you know, involved in activism, we do hear about, you know, what's happening in other countries. I think we're getting closer to that stage where, you know, we don't only care about our community here, and, you know, how can we prove, you know, our patriotism to this country, but how do we act as a true world citizen?
The issue also of commitment and citizenship. Citizenship into your new country versus longings and deep emotional ties to your blood country. And so is your commitment to your new country one of, it's a more superficial commitment, and your blood country is where your emotional and your deep, your root commitments are. So it's, I have no answers, but these are questions I pose because I often have these thoughts and these answers, and so it's not a right or, it's not a yes or no answer, but these are just issues to bring up, in issues of commitment to dual citizenship and dual country allegiances.
Are you a dual citizen?
I'd rather not answer that.
Okay.
At this moment.
Do we have any dual citizens?
Yes, I have both Mexican and American citizenship.
Since hardly anybody else here is a dual citizen, could you just say a little bit about, and you are as well? And
yeah, Colombian and
Colombia
American.
and the U.S. Maybe both of you just say a little bit about what's that like to be a dual citizen? Because, you know, some of the people who've written about this say, you know, this is a bad idea. You can't have two allegiances. Allegiance is about one place. But as I indicated at the end of my essay, there's millions and millions and millions of people in the U.S. now who are dual citizens. So what do you want to?
It's funny because I never want to become the United States. When I was in Colombia, I hate the United States. You know, because all the things you heard and you know, and in one moment of my life I had to take the decision to become. And I did it for many reasons, and one of them was because I really want to give my kids, I had two kids, better opportunities like many. So in the beginning, it was really hard. It took me almost 4 or 5 years to be happy here. So I cried for all this time, and I didn't belong here, especially because I live in Dallas, Georgia, a very red next zone. And you know, and my kids and I, we never feel like we belonged to the park. But at the same time, I really have to have the communication with my kids. So I say the only thing is I need to learn English because they are speaking English. So I force them to speak Spanish at home and English when they are outside. And I learn English, you know, like watching a lot of movies and all the kind of stuff, and taking free classes. And in one moment, one day my kids say, "Mom, do you know you are more American than us?" And I say, "Why?" "Because you follow the rules. You do everything American people do." And I say, "What is that?" I say, "You volunteer. You are involved in many things. You know more the city, what our father who was supposed to love United States." And when become my decision to apply for the citizenship, I say, you know, it takes me like a lot of emotion inside, like, you know, I feel like a traitor to Colombia, and I don't want to belong here, but I just feel in love for United States. And I say, you know, have dual citizen is like to have two lovers, you know? Like you cannot be with two at the same time, but you love both. Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to be faithful to both.
In my case, even though I was born and lived for 18 years in Mexico, our house with my mom being American and my dad being Mexican, it was very, very bicultural. I attended an American school in Mexico, so I was really comfortable from a very young age with both languages, both cultures, and with frequent travel to the United States, actually with both countries. So when I moved here for college, it was a very smooth transition. Felt very much at home, and I still feel pretty comfortable in both countries. I travel to Mexico frequently for work, and even though I'm very glad I don't live there anymore, I feel very comfortable, very much at home when I am there. And my wife's American, my kids speak very limited Spanish, and for all intents and purposes they're typical American girls. So it's been a pretty smooth transition, and I think it also has helped me a lot to feel comfortable with different cultures, traveling to different countries, being more aware of that things aren't like they are in America or Mexico for that matter. And just makes for a much smoother transition from one culture to the next.
Yeah, thanks.
I wanted to say something about the belonging, because I'm also a military brat, and I think that's a very unique perspective, and the sense of belonging. I've been in communities in this country where I did not feel I belonged, and I've been in communities in other countries where I felt I did. So it's kind of what makes that sense of belonging is a very interesting concept. And you know, I went to 13 schools growing up, and some of them I never felt I belonged, and others I felt like I moved right in and belonged pretty quickly. And there was an American school I also went to in Taiwan, and it was something about the diversity in the school. The kids were there from all over the world, where I felt I most belonged, versus ending up in Smyrna, Tennessee, felt I did not belong there. And the difference was remarkable with that sense of belonging.
Could you say a little bit more about what it was that would help you to feel like you belonged here, but that was missing in the places where you didn't feel like you belonged?
I think the openness and the worldview. I remember moving in, let's see, what year would have been, mid-50s from Alaska to Montgomery, Alabama, when the bus boycotts were starting, and seeing segregation, and feeling like, what planet am I on? This was so absurd and so strange to be in this culture. So, and I certainly found that in terms of cultures in the South in this country, cultures in the North and the Midwest, they're very, very different. And so sometimes when people come to this country and they've only been to one place, encouraging them, that's not necessarily America. America is many, many things and many different cultures within a culture.
And I think, what you were saying, there are many different kinds of America, and I would say, I would push back a little bit, and I would say there is actually no America. A nation state, I think, is a very incomprehensible idea. And, when my family calls me from India and says, how is life in the US? I say, I like living in Atlanta now, in my neighborhood, with my friends. So I think that, similarly, I'm answering questions about India all the time, and it's a crock. I'm answering questions about the class and the social background and the religion and the state that I grew up in India. So I think that for me, nation states are incomprehensible and they are political entities largely. And it's convenient, and I had the same sort of going back and forth about whether to do it or not. And at the end of the day, I think it's like belonging to a club. It was convenient. I did it. I come from enormous privilege in India. I remain in enormous privilege here. And I think it's a different decision if I was placed differently socially. But it was very practical. And I don't think that changes anything. I don't know how I feel or don't feel. Living more years in Atlanta, to me, makes me feel like I belong here. And that is purely the passage of time, my neighborhood, my friends. And, I work at the Public Defender's Office, and every day I'm more and more disgusted with this country. Every day. How my clients are treated. So I think, that keeps me happy.
You just said something that interested me. How much do you feel you can commit? When I lived in Mexico, I could not commit to Mexico. As a foreigner, I was worried about getting involved in politics or in social issues that interested me, because there's something called, being 44th out of the country, 66th out of the country, that if you get involved politically, you can be deported immediately. And so we could not do it. Any political involvement I might have had would have been with the United States when I wrote the letters and when I voted. So being here for me is, I like the fact that I can get involved. And I feel much freer to speak openly. Now, I would be interested in knowing whether there are people here who do not have their citizenship yet, who would feel uneasy about being committed to politics here, or whether they can get committed, or whether they can commit. Yeah.
Well, like for me, like you said, I'm a little bit scared because, like I always say, there is some boundary that you can't go over. You can't overstep some boundaries. Like in political, like you're talking about, I can't join any political, like voting or like get myself into any like political, stuff, because I'm afraid that I might be deported or something, because as a refugee, because I'm a refugee, I've been told that, unless you become a citizen, anything pertaining those political stuff, you have to be aware about it because you don't know what you're qualified for and what you're not qualified to do. So I'm a little bit nervous about it.
My struggle is that, I think that there's a discomfort I feel in like equating personal senses of belonging with political and social belonging. And so for instance, like, when I first went from a suburban community in Southern California to going to school in Berkeley, I suddenly saw all these images of my religion all around me, and I didn't feel like I belonged at all, right? Like that was a weird appropriation, and now I'm kind of experiencing that in Atlanta, suddenly seeing all these Hindu things around me from folks that I'm like, oh wow, that's neat, you came to this tradition differently. So like on a personal level, like, whether I felt I belonged really didn't correspond with whether I had any sort of civic participation, any sort of civic engagement, or whether or not politically I was desired to be in that community. And so those were really different things that were happening all at once. And then I also think about like the idea of commitment, right? Like there's a way in which commitment, like, I think about people committed to principles of democracy, and often I find those are the people that are the most dispossessed, right? And but like what I learned about democracy, I learned from the organizing of migrant workers in California, or the organizing of completely unincluded and dispossessed peoples in the South, and from Black organizing in the United States. So in those ways, like the idea of commitment seems ironically tied into the notion of citizenship, because the citizens in those communities were often the very ones that were absolutely anti-democratic, that were engaging in oppression. And so this notion that citizenship somehow means that people would be more invested in democracy or more invested in their community seems really unfettered to my actual experiences or the histories that I'm familiar with. The other piece that I think was so interesting in this conversation is that, there is this sense of like, well, hey, there is this community of people that I live next to, and do I belong? Do I get to kick it with you? Do I get to eat your food? Do I get to go over and like, do I get to go over and like, hang out in your shops and like spend some time with you? And growing up, I got to kick it in my friends' houses, but my friends never got to kick it in mine. And part of the reason was because like my mom didn't feel terribly comfortable with being judged that our house smelled a particular way, right? Now, who belonged? Right? Who belonged to where in that moment? And I belonged in my house, but I couldn't bring my friends in. My mom belonged in her home, but she didn't feel like she belonged 20 feet outside of her home. And yet, I would also say I felt like I belonged to this country, but in terms of the civic work that my mother has done long before she became a citizen, she's raised a hell of a lot more children here. She's actually committed to our community, grown tons of food and given it to people all around us. And I would say she's far outshone me in the commitment level of like, being involved in our community. And none of it was related to her citizenship at all. But what her citizenship meant to her was her family, right? A feeling of belonging to those people. So it's like that feels important to me, is that like, I think that there's a way in which those of us that can easily claim that we belong to a place sort of equate our own experiences, like, and I feel like I easily belong to the United States because of the way that I speak, all the formal education I've gotten, all of that stuff. But I feel the way that I can kind of experience that easy belonging to the States, I can sometimes mistake that other people have the same freedom or the same opportunity or even the same permission to do that. And I know I've made that mistake a lot, but I'm wondering how not to, like how to struggle with that, because people, in this room there's clearly very different migration histories and politics, and it's really cool.
I think that's a wonderful way to close this discussion. One question to throw out that we think about now is there, especially in our gateway states that are not used to this, I think there is this mutual welcoming that has to go on part of that. When immigrants come, particularly in large numbers, they change the community for the people who are there as much as their worlds are changed by coming. And that question is there a rate of change that you need in order to have that inclusion, that sense, that feeling of community, of a place that you can welcome other people and they can welcome you? And that's a very open question to us. And Thank you again, everybody who's participated.
First for many years.
I think it is just general discomfort, the feeling that what you're saying is not safe
religiosas o permanentes o negras, pero tienen que tener
Wonderful.
un nicho. Si no, no pueden competir con Barcelona.